Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Sutta class. We will start with the Namo Tassa. Feel free to join in if you like. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. So, welcome everyone. Today is the first session of our roughly 5-part series called Friends Beyond Death. And if you have seen the suttas that we have scheduled for the next few weeks on the Tuesday mornings, then maybe you have wondered how come that we have put all these 5 suttas together, because they have literally nothing in common. But actually they do have something in common, and the thing that they have in common is that they have a very, very beautiful background story from the commentaries. And as you know, usually I don't teach from the commentaries, but because this story is so beautiful and because it links those 5 very different suttas together, I have decided to do a small mini series on the 5 monks that have a very strong connection in a past life from a story that is told in the commentaries. And so I think it's very interesting because those suttas have a few things in common and a few things that are very different. And I think it's very interesting to put those 5 together and to have a look at those 5 monks and the suttas that the Buddha gave to them. Today we are talking about a monk called Sabya. And if you have not heard of Sabya before, I'm not surprised because he's not that famous. But he was one of the fairly early monks who joined the Buddha's teaching when, like in the early years of the Buddha's teaching. And he and a few of his friends have as I mentioned, a beautiful background story from the commentaries. And that goes back to the time of Kassapa Buddha. And Kassapa Buddha, of course, is the Buddha who was living and teaching just before our Buddha, Gautama Buddha or Shakyamuni Buddha. And so in Kassapa Buddha's time, obviously, Kassapa Buddha also was teaching the Dhamma. He founded a Sangha in the same way that Gautama Buddha founded the modern day Sangha. And then after Kassapa Buddha entered Parinibbana, over time, his Dhamma also declined, and less and less people were practicing, and the Dhamma got corrupted, and over time, it was disappearing. And towards the very, very end of Kassapa Buddha's dispensation, when very little Dhamma was left and when very few people were practicing, there was a group of 7 monks, according to the story from the commentary. And those 7 monks were really, really committed to the Buddha's teaching, and they had a very strong sense of urgency, and they had a very strong commitment to attaining arahantship in that very life back then. And so because they couldn't find suitable conditions in the Sangha as it was then, and they couldn't find supportive conditions among the Buddhist lay followers, they actually left everything behind and they went into the forest together with the intention to do very profound and deep practices and to try to attain arahantship. And so they went into the forest together, and eventually they came to a mountain. And the mountain was extremely steep, like very steep cliffs on all sides. So they had to climb up there with some kind of ladder. And when they had reached the top, they threw down the ladder so that they were trapped on the top because there were steep cliffs on all sides. And when they were trapped on the top, they made this determination that because there was nothing to eat up there. They had no food. So they made the determination they would stay up there and practice and either attain arahantship or just starve to death. So they forced themselves into a situation where they really, really had to practice. There was no other choice. And they thought that by doing this, they might have the motivation that they needed to actually do all the practices and attain arahantship. And so as they were practicing, eventually one of the 7 friends actually did attain arahantship, and he also attained all the psychic powers. So he was able to, for example, fly through the air. And since he was able to do that, he offered to his other friends who were still stuck there and still practicing to bring some food to the mountain so that they could gain some strength and continue practicing. But the others declined the offer, and they said no, that would kind of interrupt their commitment, and they had decided to not eat again in this life, and that would kind of lessen their motivation to practice, and that would kind of distract them from practice and diminish their sense of urgency. So they just told that friend who had attained arahantship to just, go away and enjoy the rest of his life, basically, and to just leave them to their practice. So that friend left, and eventually that friend came to the end of his life, and he entered parinibbana. And the other 6 continued to practice on that mountain, and eventually another one of the 6 attained anagamiship, non-return. And as a non-returner, he also had extremely strong samadhi, and he also had the psychic powers. And again, he offered to bring food to the other 5. And again, the other 5 declined with the same reasoning that it would kind of take away from their motivation to practice. And so that anagami friend also flew away through the air, and eventually that anagami friend also came to the end of his life, and he passed away and was reborn in the pure abodes. The pure abodes obviously is the destination in the 4th jhana realm, where only non-returners are reborn. And from there, usually they attain parinibbana. And the other 5 continued to practice on that mountain, but they didn't attain anything, and eventually they starved to death, and they just died without any kind of attainment. And so they continued the transmigration in samsara, but because of their strong commitment to practice, and because of this extreme love of the Dhamma and extreme sense of urgency that they had extremely good conditions and were reborn again in the time of Gautama Buddha as human beings in India. So the seeds that they had planted in Kassapa Buddha's time led them to be reborn in Gautama Buddha's time. And eventually in Gautama Buddha's time, all of them came in contact with the Buddha. Most of them became monks, and all of them either attained non-return or arahantship. So eventually they also had a happy end. And the stories of those 5 monks are the stories that we're going to look at in the next 5 weeks. And so today we are looking at the first one of them, which is Sabya. And Sabya is a very interesting case because he was someone who was already born into the spiritual life. Not as a bhikkhu, but he was born to a female wanderer, like to a woman who had already gone forth in another spiritual movement. So he never was a householder. He grew up his entire life being an ascetic practitioner. And his story actually is extremely dramatic and also very traumatic, especially the story of his mother. Because his mother, when she was young, her parents gave her to a spiritual teacher with the hope that he would teach her a spiritual path and guide her towards a meritorious life and towards some kind of spiritual attainment. Obviously, at that time, there was no Buddhism, but there were lots of other spiritual practitioners and spiritual groups. So she was given like she was made to go forth by her parents and given to that teacher to be taught. But because she was a young woman and fairly attractive, eventually that teacher raped her, and also the community around that teacher, the male community, raped her. And eventually she got pregnant. And when she got pregnant, that community expelled her because, well, having a woman there who was pregnant would look really, really bad. Because obviously as a spiritual movement, they should be celibate. So having a pregnant woman there would show to the lay people that they weren't practicing well. So they kicked her, they blamed her, then they kicked her out and they left her all alone. So she was a young woman, all alone in the forest, pregnant with no place to go. And so physically she was in an extremely vulnerable situation, but also mentally she was in a really bad space because of what had happened to her, being gang raped, and then not just by anybody, but by the teacher that she was trusting and that was supposed to be a spiritual role model. So she was really, really disillusioned and in a really bad space. And this is the situation that Sabia was born into. So he really kind of experienced suffering heads on from the very moment that he was born. And also he had a lot of questions about the validity of a spiritual life and what it means to lead a spiritual life and what it means to be a spiritual teacher. So he was an ascetic practitioner, but he didn't really have a path that he was following, and he didn't really have a teacher that he trusted. And that is something that we will see in his sutta that we are reading now. This is the question that he has grown up with, that he has struggled with his entire life, and that he brings to the Buddha. And I think we have to know this background story, even though this is also from the commentaries, in order to really understand why he's asking the questions to the Buddha that he's asking in this sutta. So I think we can start reading the sutta now. This is from the Sutta Nipata 3.6. There is a link in the description box, and there's also a link in the live chat. And I will be reading from Bhante Sujato's translation. And we are very fortunate because Bhante Sujato just finished his translation of the Sutta Nipata a few weeks ago, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we are lucky that this is available. And yeah, I will be reading from here. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the live chat. And the sutta begins. So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying near Rajagaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel's feeding ground. Now at that time, the wanderer Sabia had been presented with a question by a deity who was a former relative, saying, Sabia, you should practice the spiritual life with whatever ascetic or Brahmin answers this question. So this introduction already is interesting because this motif of a deity coming to the monk and giving him a question and in some way guiding him towards the proper teacher, which of course is the Buddha. This is something that will recur again a few times in the next few weeks. And the commentary says that this deity is that sixth friend, the friend who became an anagami in Kassapa Buddha's time. And that friend, well, it seems that he was still looking out for his 5 other friends that he had to leave behind back then. And since he was an anagami, he was still around. Obviously, the arahant friend had already entered parinibbana. He was no longer around, but the anagami friend was still around. And he was still looking out for his the 5 human friends, and he was trying to sort of guide them towards Gautama Buddha this time so that they would also have the chance to become fully enlightened and practice the Dhamma. So I think it's very beautiful that that friend, after such a long time, is still looking out for them. And here we see that this anagami friend, that deity, gives him a means to actually identify a good teacher, and kind of, like through this, guides him to the Buddha. And of course, this is also the question that Sabya has been struggling with his entire life, to find a good ascetic or Brahmin who actually can teach him how to practice a spiritual life that is fruitful, and to tell him what actually the meaning is of living a spiritual life. So the deity gives him a question, and by this question, Sabya can tell good teachers from bad teachers. And then Sabya, after learning that question in the presence of their deity, approached those ascetics and Brahmins who led an order and a community and taught a community, who were well-known and famous religious founders regarded as holy by many people. That is Purana Kassapa, Makkali Gosala, Nigantanatha Buddha, Sanjaya Belati Buddha, Pakuda Kachayana, and Ajita Kesa Kambala. So these are, of course, the famous leaders. This is a list of the famous leaders of other spiritual movements that recurs many times in other suttas as well. And then he asked them that question, but they were stumped by it, and displaying annoyance, hate, and bitterness, they questioned Sabya in return. So obviously they were not the teachers that he was looking for. They got angry. They didn't know how to answer. Then they got angry and turned against him. So obviously he again was making really bad experiences with those other teachers, as his mother had done in the past. So this obviously didn't help in any way to give him any faith in the spiritual practice. So then Sabya thought, those famous ascetics and Brahmins were stumped by my question. Displaying annoyance, hate, and bitterness, they questioned me in return on that matter. Why don't I return to a lesser life so I can enjoy sensual pleasures? So this obviously is a reference to disrobing. A lesser life refers to lay life. So he's thinking, well, I can't gain anything from a spiritual life. I have no path. I have no teacher. I don't really know what I'm doing. So why don't I become a layperson? Then at least I can enjoy sensual pleasures. That's in the long run, that's not really useful either, because sensual pleasures are fleeting and they disappear, and they are impermanent. But at least there is some kind of short-term benefit. And in the spiritual life, he didn't see any kind of benefit. So he's thinking about disrobing here. And then Sabya thought, this ascetic Gautama also leads an order and a community and teaches a community. He's a well-known and famous religious founder regarded as holy by many people. Why don't I ask him this question? Then he thought, even those ascetics and Brahmins who are elderly and senior, who are advanced in years and have reached the final stage of life, who are senior, long-standing, long gone forth, who lead an order and a community and teach a community, who are well-known and famous religious founders regarded as holy by many people. That is Purana Kassapa and so on, were stumped by my question. They displayed annoyance, hate, and bitterness, and even questioned me in return. How can the ascetic Gautama possibly answer my question, since he is so young in age and newly gone forth? So this is obviously he describes the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, as being young in age and newly gone forth. So this is one of the indications that tells us that Sabya probably was one of the fairly early students of Gautama Buddha, not one of the very, very earliest, because Gautama Buddha is already described as being a leader of a community and being reasonably famous. But probably this was somewhat towards the beginning of his teaching, since he's described as being young and newly gone forth. And obviously, also the location of this sutta in the Sutta Nipata also tells us that it is probably one of the fairly early texts. The Sutta Nipata is one of the texts that contain a huge amount of extremely early material. We have seen that in the last few weeks when I was teaching about the foremost lay people, or the chief lay people, that many of them had memorized entire chapters of the Sutta Nipata, and we also see that recurring in other places of the suttas where monks and nuns memorize whole chapters of the Sutta Nipata. So the Sutta Nipata was very popular, something that the early monastics already memorized in the Buddha's time. So this must have been one of the very, very early texts. And because they contain a lot of material that is very, very inspirational, that you can use for contemplation in your Dhamma practice or in your meditation. This particular sutta we are reading today is very good for Buddhanusati or Sanghanusati, so recollection of the Buddha and recollection of the Sangha. So the location of this sutta in the Sutta Nipata also tells us that this seems to be a fairly early sutta and that Sabya seems to have been a fairly early monk. Anyway, then Sabya thought, an ascetic should not be looked down upon or disparaged because they are young. Though young, the ascetic Gautama has great psychic power and might. Why don't I ask him this question? Then Sabya set out for Rajagaha. So Sabya thinks, well, you should not look down upon somebody because they are young. And I think this is a very, very interesting observation, because this is something obviously that people were very respectful towards people who are advanced in years, who are elderly, because it seems that they are wiser than young people. And that is something that even the Buddha struggled with. Many people sort of looked down upon him because he was younger. It's a topic that comes up sometimes in the suttas. Brahmins criticize him when they are elderly and he's junior. And King Pasenadi, for example, criticized him and questioned him because he was so young. And the Buddha always said that, well, you should not judge people by the physical age that they have. There's one sutta, for example, where the Buddha says there are 4 things that you should not look down upon because they're young. One is a young prince, because eventually that young prince will become a king. And if you have mistreated him previously, then he will take revenge on you. The second thing is small fire, because a small fire can turn into a huge conflagration and burn down entire districts. And the third one is a young snake, because even a young snake can be extremely venomous and kill you. And the fourth one is a young ascetic, because the physical age doesn't matter, especially in Buddhism, where we have rebirth and where you can bring so many tendencies from your past lives. And even as a human being, you could be a reborn stream enterer, you could be a reborn once returner. So even though you might be young, you can have extremely high spiritual attainments. So the physical age really, really doesn't matter, because we can bring so many things from past lives. And especially as monastics, people can ordain when they're 20 and people can ordain when they're 70. So I've seen that many times, that people are so much more respectful towards monks who are 70. And then it turns out that they have ordained like literally a week ago. And they completely ignore the younger monks who might have been ordained for 20 or 30 years already. So physical age is really not a good indicator of whether or not somebody has something to share in the Dhamma. And especially in Buddhism, we also know that there were arahants. One of the people we will talk about in a few weeks in this series became an arahant when he was 7. So clearly, age is not a good indicator. So anyway, Sabya comes to the same conclusion, and he decides to ask the Buddha, even though he is so young. And he sets out for Rajagaha. Then traveling stage by stage, he came to Rajagaha, the bamboo grove, the squirrels' feeding ground. He went up to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with him. When the greetings and polite conversation were over, he sat down to one side and addressed the Buddha in verse. I've come full of doubts and uncertainties, said Sabya, wishing to ask a question. Please solve them for me, answer my questions in turn, in accordance with the truth. You have come from afar, Sabya, said the Buddha. wishing to ask a question. I shall solve them for you, answering your questions in turn in accordance with the truth. Ask me your questions, Sabya, whatever you want. I'll solve each and every question you have. And then Sabya thought, it's incredible, it's amazing. Where those other ascetics and Brahmins didn't even give me a chance. The Buddha has invited me. Uplifted and elated, full of rapture and happiness, he asked this question. So here we have Sabya, and Sabya says right from the beginning that he is full of doubts and uncertainties. And I think we can really understand that when we take into consideration his life story and the traumatic events that he and his mother have been through, and the confusion he grew up in, and the fact that he didn't really have a good teacher, or didn't really have a goal in his spiritual life. So obviously he's extremely confused, and his entire life he has just had all these questions and nobody to answer them. And the Buddha just tells him straight away, yeah, you can ask me all your questions. And he not only says, ask me all your questions, but he also promises to give him answers. So we can only imagine how relieved Sabya feels at this point, because his entire life he had those questions and this confusion, and his life has no direction. And finally he finds somebody who seems to know what he's talking about. So that mental relief he must be feeling at this point must be quite amazing. And so uplifted and elated, as the text describes, full of rapture and happiness. I think it's very easy to understand why he would be so relieved at this point. Especially as he says, those other ascetics and Brahmins didn't even give me a chance, but the Buddha has invited me. So he asks, what must one attain to be called a mendicant? Said Sabya. How is one sweet? How said to be tamed? How is one declared to be awakened? May the Buddha please answer my question. So Sabya is asking what it means to be a mendicant. Like, what is the goal of a spiritual life? What is how do you actually become a proper mendicant? How do you actually properly practice that path? And then he uses a few synonyms here, and actually all of these synonyms are synonyms for being an arahant. So what does it mean to have walked the spiritual path to the very end? So the synonyms he's asking for is being a mendicant, being a sweet one, being a tamed one, and being awakened. I think awakened is clear. A tamed one is something that is a synonym for an arahant that recurs quite often in the suttas. A sweet one isn't something that we see too often, so that's a little bit unique to this sutta. But I think from context, it's clear that this also refers to somebody who is very accomplished on the spiritual path. So, and now the Buddha answers the question. When by the path they have walked themselves, said the Buddha to Sabya, they reach quenching, with doubt overcome, giving up desire to continue existence or to end it. Their journey complete, their rebirth ended, that is a mendicant. So the Buddha now answers in 4 stanzas, 1 stanza for each of the 4 synonyms that Sabya has asked for. And the first synonym that he asked for was a mendicant. And the Buddha says a mendicant is someone who has walked the path themselves. So it's not just a theoretical knowledge. They've actually walked the path to the very end. They reach quenching. So quenching here is a translation for parinibbana. So they have walked to the very end, to nibbana. And they have overcome doubt. This is something that will recur again and again in this sutta, especially because the Buddha is talking to Sabya, and Sabya is coming with all these doubts, the doubts that have tormented him his entire life. And they are giving up desire for both extremes of existence, like the desire to continue existing and the desire to end existence. because both of these desires presume that there is a stable self there, and the self will continue existing or will stop existing. And since we're talking about dependent origination in Buddhism, neither a fixed continued existence, an absolute existence, or a complete destruction makes sense in a Buddhist thought world. So a mendicant clearly understands this and gives up the attachment to either of those two extremes. Their journey complete, obviously this is again, they have reached Nibbana, and their rebirths have ended, of course, since they have no more attachments to either existing or not existing. That means there is nothing that binds them to a future rebirth. So they will not take a new life after this body breaks up. And that is a mendicant. So first of all, the Buddha gives him the very broad overall vision of what it means to walk to the end of the path. And then in the next stanza, the Buddha says, equanimous towards everything, mindful, they don't harm anyone in the world. An ascetic who has crossed over, unclouded, not full of themselves, is sweet-natured. So here he's talking about the second synonym, being the sweet one, or being sweet-natured. And here the Buddha is giving a little bit more details. He is giving a few mental qualities that he should develop. For example, being equanimous, being mindful. Then he says they don't harm anyone in the world. This obviously is not just a mental quality. This is also a physical and a verbal action. And I think this also reminds us a little bit of the teaching that is given by all the Buddhas. So again, I think this draws a small loop again to other Buddhas, Kassapa Buddha and all the other Buddhas, because we have this stanza in the Pali version, we have it in the Dhammapada. In other Buddhist traditions, we have this in the Patimokkha's, the introductions to the Patimokkha's, or actually the concluding verses of the Patimokkha's. And we know that some Buddhas, such as Gautama Buddha, they lay down a full monastic code, and other Buddhas, they don't give a monastic code, they just teach Dhamma. But all Buddhas, whether they lay down a monastic code or they don't, they always, those that don't have a monastic code, they just give this stanza that says, refraining from doing evil and just doing good and purifying the mind. That is the teaching of all the Buddhas. So whether they lay down a monastic code or not, this is the stanza that they give people instead of laying down a full monastic code. Not doing evil, doing good, and purifying the mind. That is the most basic summary of the teaching of the Buddhas. And I think this not doing evil or not harming anyone, this is probably a reference to that stanza. So, and again, to the teaching of all the Buddhas, not just Gautama Buddha's teaching. Then the Buddha says, an ascetic who has crossed over, this again, of course, refers to crossing the flood of samsara, going to the safe shore, to Nibbana, and being unclouded. The clouds are obviously the defilements in the mind, or the asavas in the mind. So unclouded means your mind is pure and clear and liberated, and they're not full of themselves. So obviously they have overcome conceit, the conceit of being better than others, being full of themselves, but also all other kinds of conceit. And that means that they are sweet-natured. And then the third stanza is about the tamed one. And the Buddha says, their faculties have been developed inside and out in the whole world. Having pierced through this world and the next, tamed, they bide their time. So here the Buddha gives a little bit more detail about the path, developing their spiritual faculties. So these are, of course, the 5 faculties, which are 2 pairs and 1 extra one. The 2 pairs are faith or confidence and wisdom, and then energy and samadhi. And the 5th one is mindfulness. these are the 5 faculties, that the spiritual faculties that you have to develop to practice the path. And of course, arahants are fully developed in those 5 faculties, inside and out in the whole world. And they have pierced through this world, and the next step means they have fully understood this life and also the future rebirths and the mechanisms for future rebirth. Tamed means they are no longer under the sway of their defilements, and they bide their time. And of course, this mentioning of biding one's time is also something that comes up again in a few other suttas. Especially there is one sutta where I think Sariputta is asked why an arahant, after they attain arahantship, they still continue to live on as long as this body is viable, and when the body breaks up, then they parinibbana. So why don't they enter parinibbana straight away? Why is it that they continue on living in this body until the body breaks up? Since they have nothing further to do, it's basically why would you continue to live on? And Sariputta says, well, it's like a workman who has done all his work, but he has not yet received his wages. So he's just waiting to receive the benefit from his work, the wages that he is supposed to get. And in the same way, the arahant has done all his work, and he's waiting to get the full benefit of what he should get from the work. And that period in between full awakening and the end of their life is just them biding the time, waiting to get the final benefit that is due to them. So this idea here that they are biding their time probably links in with that other simile in the other sutta. So this is the tamed one. And finally, we come to the awakened one. And here the Buddha says, they have examined the eons in their entirety and both sides of transmigration, passing away and rebirth. Rid of dust, unblemished, purified, the one they call awakened has attained the end of rebirth. So here in this stanza, we have a reference to the 3 knowledges, the Tevijja. The first of the 3 knowledges is, of course, the recollection of past lives in all of their details. So not just a kind of general overview, but to remember each and every single detail of each and every life for many, many eons in the past. So 1 eon is, of course, the life term of a universe. So from the time of a universe developing and expanding to the universe contracting and disappearing, that is 1 eon in Buddhism. And if you have the 3 knowledges, especially that first knowledge or recollection of past lives, then you can recall many, many eons, many, many lifetimes of universes and all the lives that you have had in that time with all the details. That's the first knowledge. And then the second knowledge is, of course, with the divine eye to see beings reappearing, passing away and reappearing according to the karma that they have made. So this is the second line here, both sides of transmigration, passing away and rebirth. This is the second of the 3 knowledges, this recollection, seeing beings passing away and reappearing. And this is when you fully understand how karma works and how rebirth works. And then finally, the third of the 3 knowledges is the knowledge of the destruction of the taints. So the knowledge that you have attained full arahantship, full liberation. So at that point, you are rid of dust. That means rid of the defilements. Your mind is entirely unblemished, entirely purified. And if you have those 3 knowledges, then you are fully awakened and you have attained the end of rebirth. So the Buddha here is giving Sabya a full vision of the path. He is giving him really the goal that he needs to aspire to when he leads a spiritual life. And he also starts to give him a few pointers of how to do this, like with equanimity, with mindfulness, not doing evil, and so on. So he's starting also to outline the path to attain that goal. And then, having approved and agreed with what the Buddha said, uplifted and elated, full of rapture and happiness, Sabya asked another question. So Sabya is really overjoyed when he gets this teaching, because, we can only imagine that he would be so relieved at this point to have these kinds of teachings and finally to understand what his holy life is actually all about. And the sutta continues for quite a while longer in a very similar way. I'm looking at the time, and I think I probably have to skip a few parts. I was hoping to actually talk about a few more things, but I think we'll have to skip. So this sutta actually has 5 groups of 4 stanzas. So what we just went through is 1/5 of this sutta. So the sutta continues in the same pattern, Sabya asking for more synonyms of arahants and the Buddha giving more details about the path. So for example, in the next one, Sabya asks about a Brahmin, an ascetic, a bathed initiate, and a giant. All these are, of course, synonyms for arahants, and the Buddha then continues. And then we have 3 more of these groups of question and answers. And I will now skip ahead and skip through all of this to the end of this sutta. And I will continue reading towards the end. And the text says, and then, having approved and agreed with what the Buddha said, uplifted and elated, full of rapture and happiness, Sabya got up from his seat, arranged his robe over one shoulder, raised his joint palms towards the Buddha, and extolled the Buddha in his presence with fitting verses. So Sabya is just really overjoyed at this point that he has finally found a teacher and finally understood what the monastic life is about. And he says, "Oh, one of vast wisdom, there are 63 opinions. Based on the doctrines of ascetics, they are expressions of perception based on perception. Having dispelled them all, you passed over the dark flood." So now he's just praising the Buddha, and that's why I said this sutta is so beautiful for recollection of the Buddha, Buddhanusati, and also Sanghanusati, because we have all these descriptions of arahants there and all these huge amounts of synonyms and these huge amounts of descriptions of the final goal. So I think it's not surprising that the early Sangha memorized this text so much, and especially like all the texts of the Sutta Nipata actually, because these are very beautiful summaries of the Dhamma and because they're really, really useful for meditation practice. And here Sabya says, well, other ascetics, the doctrines of other ascetics, they all cling to certain kinds of opinions or views, but the Buddha has dispelled all views, and he has crossed over that dark flood, this murky kind of forest, this thicket of views where other people get entangled and get stuck. And of course, the number 63 is a little bit unusual. In the Brahmachala Sutta, we talk of 62 views. Here, there seems to be one more. I'm not exactly sure what the additional one is, but I think the numbers are fairly similar, so it must be a very, very similar concept. You have gone to the end, gone beyond suffering. You are perfected, a fully awakened Buddha. I think you have ended defilements. Splendid, intelligent, abounding in wisdom, ender of suffering, you brought me across. So here he's just describing more attributes of the Buddha, rejoicing in all his beautiful qualities. And then he also says, you brought me across. So that seems to mean that he at least attained stream entry at this point. So he obviously had a huge benefit from hearing this teaching. When you understood my uncertainty, you brought me beyond doubt. Homage to you, a sage accomplished in the ways of sagacity. You are gentle, not hard-hearted, O kinsman of the sun. So again, Sabya mentions how uncertain he was in the beginning, how he was full of doubt, and how joyful he is that his doubt is now extinguished. And again, this is something that shows us that he attained stream entry, because obviously overcoming doubt is one of the fetters that we, like doubt is one of the fetters that we cut off at stream entry. The idea, calling the Buddha kinsman of the sun, this is because the Sakya clan that the Buddha is from, in mythology, claims to have descended from the god of the sun god. That's why he's called kinsman of the sun. And one of the things we also see here a little bit in the English translation, in the line that says, a sage accomplished in the ways of sagacity, is that this sutta actually is linguistically also very beautiful, because it's full of puns and it's full of word plays in the Pali, of course, which is very, very difficult to capture in English. But of course, the early Sangha would have easily understood all those word plays, since that they spoke languages similar to Pali. And that again makes it a very interesting sutta to memorize, and of course a very enjoyable sutta, because it's so full of word plays and also makes it easy to memorize. And we see that here a little bit with Bhante Sujato tried to capture that a little bit with sage and sagacity, so that to capture that little wordplay there. But of course, in the Pali, there are so many more, and we can't really capture all of them in English. And then Sabya continues, any doubts that I once had, you have answered for me, O seer. Clearly, you are a sage and awakened one. There are no hindrances in you. So again, the idea of doubts, overcoming doubts. All your distress is blown away and mowed down, cooled, tamed, steadfast. Truth is your strength. I think this is just really beautiful. Like, it's so beautiful. I almost get goosebumps when I just read this. So I think it's a really, really beautiful sutta here. O giant among giants, O great hero, when you are speaking, all the gods rejoice, including both Narada and Pabata. So Narada and Pabata, apparently, they're not very famous gods. They don't, I think they don't really appear in many other places in the canon, maybe one or two other places. I believe that they were actually Brahmin seers or mythological figures of the past. After they came to the end of their human lifespan, they were reborn in a heaven realm. And for that reason, they are now considered gods and are included here in the mention of all the gods rejoice, including those two Brahmin seers, like former Brahmin seers. Homage to you, O thoroughbred, homage to you, supreme among men. In the world with its gods, you have no counterpart. You are the Buddha, you are the teacher, you are the sage who has overcome Mara. You have cut off the underlying tendencies, you have crossed over, you bring humanity across. You have transcended attachments, your defilements are shattered. You are a lion free of grasping, with fear and dread given up. Like a graceful lotus to which water does not stick, so both good and evil do not stick to you. Stretch out your feet, O great hero. Sabya bows to the teacher. So again, here in the last few stanzas, we have so many qualities of the Buddha, beautiful qualities that we can use for meditation, for the recollection of the Buddha and the recollection of arahants, if we memorize these kinds of suttas, so that they come to mind while we are doing meditation or contemplation. So this is another huge benefit of memorizing suttas. Then the wanderer Sabya bowed with his head at the Buddha's feet and said, "Excellent, sir, excellent. I go for refuge to the Buddha, to the teaching, and to the mendicant Sangha. Sir, may I receive the going forth, the ordination in the Buddha's presence?" So he's now so much convinced by the Buddha's teaching that he's asking for the full ordination. And the Buddha says, Sabya. Here in the text, there is a mistake, which says Senya, but obviously his name is Sabya, and the Pali version also says Sabya. Sabya, if someone formally ordained in another sect wishes to take the going forth, the ordination in this teaching and training, they must spend 4 months on probation. When 4 months have passed, if the mendicants are satisfied, they'll give the going forth, the ordination into monkhood. However, I have recognized individual differences in this matter. So the Buddha tells him, since he is not a layperson who wants to ordain as a Buddhist monastic, he is an ascetic who formerly was living with a non-Buddhist spiritual movement. He has to take a probation period of 4 months before he can be fully admitted into the Sangha. And that is because you have to be sure that he really wants to train in the Buddha's teaching. It's not just a trick. He's not just trying to discredit the Sangha by joining and then misbehaving or something, or doing other things that might be undesirable in the Sangha or making trouble there. So people were asked to spend 4 months on probation so that their behavior could be observed and people could be sure that they are sincere applicants into the Sangha. And this is something that we still have in the Patimokkha nowadays. So if, for example, a Christian monastic wanted to join the Buddhist order, then we would ask them to go on probation for 4 months as well. But the Buddha says he can recognize individual differences in this matter. So, of course, the Buddha can see the person's sincerity because he can read minds. So the Buddha can see if the person is actually a suitable candidate. And because the Buddha can see that, he can actually decide to skip that probation period if he wants to. But Sabya says, sir, if 4 months probation are required, in such a case, I'll spend 4 years on probation. So Sabya is really, really determined to join the Sangha, and he wants to make clear that he'll do whatever is necessary to be given the chance to become a Buddhist monastic. So even spending 4 years on probation, he doesn't care. And he says, when 4 years have passed, if the mendicants are satisfied, let them give me the going forth, the ordination into monkhood. So Sabya wants to make clear that he doesn't have any kind of other ulterior motives. He really has a sincere heart, and he really just wants to join the Sangha and practice. And anyway, we have heard that he just became a stream enterer, at least a stream enterer. So clearly he must have quite pure motives to join. And the Buddha also sees that. So the Buddha says, the Buddha doesn't say anything, but the wanderer Sabya received the going forth and the ordination in the Buddha's presence. So he got ordained straight away. The Buddha gave him an exception. And the Venerable Sabya became one of the perfected. So he became an arahant. So finally, Sabya had a happy end. After everything he went through in Kassapa Buddha's time, starving to death, trying to become an arahant, trying to practice Dhamma, and then all the huge amount of suffering he and his family, his mother, had to go through in this life, he did have a happy end and he became an arahant. So this is the Sabya Sutta, and I see I have used up almost all the time. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat and I will see if I can answer them. And I see that a lot of people have typed, but I don't really see any questions so far. Welcome to everybody who is joining in. So nice to see all of you. I see a huge amount of emojis. I'm glad you enjoyed this. And says, Aya, can you please briefly summarize what the other questions were? I can. Yes, I can. I'll just have a look if there are any more questions, so I know how much time I can spend. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are 20 questions in total. We have looked at 4. The other 16 are fairly similar. So all of the questions are about synonyms for arahants. So a naga, a noble one, a washed one, an ascetic, a Brahmin, a wanderer, and so on. Many, many synonyms. And the Buddha gives a sort of mentions more qualities of arahants, mentions more qualities that you should develop on the path. So it's actually quite similar to what we have read so far already. I think it's fairly easy to understand if you read it yourself. So it's just qualities that you should develop if you want to attain arahantship, and qualities that arahants have, and ways to practice the path, and what it means to attain the final goal. So I think, yeah, these are the questions. And then Meng Li asks, how could we learn from this sutta? I think it's very easy to understand. This sutta actually isn't difficult to understand. So I have left a link in the live chat, and I've left a link in the description box. You can just read it for yourself. There are English translations and translations into many other languages. So it's not a sutta that is difficult to understand, but I think it's a sutta that is worth contemplating on. So it's a sutta that is worth reading, maybe even reading before you start your meditation practice. I think this is a sutta where, for example, you could read one verse every day and then just contemplate on that verse for a few minutes and see if that means anything to you, to your practice, if you can gain any kind of inspiration from that sutta. So I think it's a very valuable sutta, and it's worth taking it very slowly, just reading it over the course of maybe 2 or 3 weeks, 1 or 2 stanzas every day. I think that it's a very worthwhile sutta. I think you can gain a lot if you just read it very slowly. Okay, and I don't see any further question. I see somebody writing in Thai. Meng Li is writing in Thai. I don't know what that means, sorry. So yeah, I don't see any further questions, and we have also come to the end of this hour of Sutta class. So next week we will continue with one of Sabia's friends, and we can end now with 3 sadhus. Feel free to join in if you like. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And see you all next week.